A lot of things work. All the energy psychology methods all work. They're all great. It's just that Larry has refined it. I don't think it can be refined much more than Larry has refined it to its essence. I don't know how you can get better than instant.
In fact, the client does not have to know what the problem is at all, nor does he have to have any sophisticated language to identify the problem. All he has to do to treat a problem effectively is to consciously notice that he is in some way not in a state of mental, emotional, physical, or spiritual ease.
Do people have to have done taps for the instant treatment to work?
No. I don't even introduce the taps to people anymore. We've instructed our subconscious minds to do the treatment as if we were doing all the tapping and making all the statements about I'm eliminating all the sadness and all the roots and deepest cause of all this problem, with exactly the same effectiveness.
Do you know what it is that your clients do?
No. My childhood was a major, long history of suffering. Excellent preparation for leading me to create Be Set Free Fast. And I call it the kind of suffering that makes poets, artists, and shrinks, because it makes you sensitive to an awful lot of things. And I was a very sensitive child. I grew up in the Midwest, really very, very rural Midwest. I was born in a farmhouse. I went to 2 one-room country schools. Up until 1943, when I was 8 and a half, my father had been a farmer working with his father fixing pumps and windmills as well as farming, and then he decided to move to town and be a plumber. And my father was very bright, very hard-working, and very task-oriented. He just would work and work and work under any kind of conditions. He didn't make a difference what the weather was. And I would go with him, being the oldest son, to help him in all kinds of weather, and I was quite miserable in that climate. And my father was very bright. He was undereducated because he stayed home to work and help the parents out. He was one of 13 children. My father and mother didn't know very much about parenting. They were just doing what they'd been programmed to do in their subconscious minds. And it was very tough for us. I was the second of 7 children, and so I thought I'd follow in my father's footsteps and be a plumber. Dad was very bright and very clever and very good with words, and unfortunately he used it much like Don Rickles does in his humor at somebody else's expense. And it was very clever, but I don't know if he realized, how hard it was on us kids growing up, being made fun of that way, joked about, teased. He was a great teaser. One of the more extreme kinds of things he would do he'd introduce me to somebody and say, "This is Larry. He was a twin, and the smart one died," which is very clever, but it didn't feel very good to me as a kid growing up. I grew up with a very mediocre performance in school because I was a very, very anxious, nervous, tense person, and didn't think that I was smart enough to ever go to college, but I got very interested in psychology from one class I had in high school, taught by the school counselor. But she said you'd have to have a master's degree to do anything in the field of psychology, and I didn't think I was smart enough to even go to college. So when I finished high school in 1952, I just assumed I'd go ahead and be a plumber with my dad. But I think it was my dad's idea for me to go to college, and so I found myself that fall going to this small school and kind of floundering because I didn't think I was very smart. I lived out my self-belief from my subconscious programming that I was mediocre at best, and so I had like a C+ average. And I finally decided, well, I'll go to the Army and figure out what I want to do, then I'll go back to school. And that's when I really started studying and reading more about psychology and got very, very interested in it. So I went back to college then.
Yeah, what was your graduate training?
I should have been in clinical psychology, but I wasn't about to look inside. So I hid out in the laboratory, basically. The second semester, I got a job with the professor who taught me the introduction to psychology, because I done so well in the class. And so I worked with him in the laboratory with white rats and all that. I like to say in those days some of my best friends were rats. So I studied a lot of experimental psychology and was trained to be a researcher. Because I was so determined to succeed and so driven by my own anxieties and my own perfectionism that I worked hard at it, and I found that I got all A's and B's, and that really amazed me because I never thought I could ever do that. But it was a hard price to pay because I really pushed myself awfully hard. But I outlasted him. But all through, probably in late grade school, and certainly by the time I was in junior high school, I was very depressed. I was bitter and hostile and sarcastic and critical, and I could just slice people up with my words, just like I learned from my dad. I perfected it in the Army. And I was really quite suicidal. I didn't really want to be alive. Well, I guess I wanted to, because I never really gave up hope completely. But 4 times from that time during high school and on up to maybe by the time I was 45 or so, there were 4 different times when I seriously attempted suicide. And each time I had it all planned out, I set it up to do it, and I would back away at the last moment. And finally I just gave up on the idea of that, saying, well, Larry, you've run enough research on yourself to know you're not really going to do it. You just will give up on the idea. So I gave up on that idea, but I still was depressed. After I got out of college, and I just recognized and said to myself, you're pretty miserable and your relationships don't work very well. You need to do something about you. And that's when I went to the sensitivity groups and started making some changes. And I did. I mean, it did help me some. The big change for me, though, was after I got out of graduate school and playing scientist. For some reason, somebody who was in one of the groups that I was in, the Rogerian groups and the Gestalt groups, was teaching classes out at San Diego State in psychology of personality, and he was leaving that position, and he recommended to them that I teach psychology of personality. Well, I only had 1 class in personality and a theories of personality in graduate school, and here I was teaching psychology of personality, and I was fascinated with it. I went into counseling with a psychiatrist who did the Gestalt therapy work with me, worked with my wife, my first wife, and I on a lot of issues, and it was then when I decided I want to be a clinical psychologist. I started therapy and doing counseling in a psychiatric medical clinic in Burbank, California. Right away, I was thrown in the mix of treating severe psychotic people, and I had no training in it. But there were 14 other therapists in that group, and I was reading like crazy, and I could go to ask them questions. And so I started picking it up and learned on the job. It was on-the-job training. I kept looking and learning more tools, looking for more and more ways to help people and trying to combine them and integrate them together, all of that. Then my wife and I moved up to Northern California and started a counseling practice up there. And that was really fun because it was a small community in Ukiah, California, and I was a big fish in a little pond. It was like being in my small hometown, and that was really fun to do that, and I didn't think I'd ever want to leave there, but it became very important that we moved back down to Southern California, and I didn't want to. And but I had promised my wife that if it didn't really work out, that for her, that I would move back. So we did, very reluctantly. And they tell me the heel marks have worn off of I-5 now, where I was dragging my feet going back. But I went back into private practice in Southern California, and using the traditional therapy methods that I had learned, and I had learned many more of them and kept learning more of them. But I was getting so frustrated and so discouraged because I found that the traditional methods were helpful and the therapeutic relationship was helpful, but it just never could seem to be completely adequate or completely thorough, so that people would come crashing down later on a lot. And that was very hard for me because I really did want to be helpful to people. And it was hard for me to watch their suffering.